Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Phillip, and today we have Charles Tassell, council member of Deer Park, just outside of Cincinnati, here to talk to us about issues of real estate, land, and some of the requests people make when it comes to land and real estate and who owns it that are sometimes difficult for government to deal with, but individuals like you need to listen to them and try to figure it all out and deal with it and try to reason with them and not offend them, and I'm sure that's not an easy job.
Say, when you're balancing property rights, it's always a touchy issue.
And I know you deal with this in your personal life too, in your own business. You deal with property, and so maybe you have a couple different perspectives on how real estate works and what is the domain of government, what is the domain of business, and how sometimes those domains can collide when it comes to people wanting government to take ownership over individuals and what that means and so on.
Or a taking in and of itself. Because they say, well, I don't want that property developed, and yeah, my neighbor might own it and I don't, but I don't want them to do anything with it. And it's like, you don't own it. If you want to control that, buy it. The Benjamins control that. And the reality is they try to go around that, and there's a good reason we have a democratic republic, not a democracy. Otherwise, mob rule we're going to take away this person's rights because we want to. And I see that a lot, especially in the professional capacity, dealing with real estate and property rights issues. But you see it as a council member when people come to you and say, well, I don't like that. Make them stop. And it's like, you have your property rights, they have their property rights, and let's realize that there's a property line there for a reason. You don't get to control what they do.
Well, this is an interesting discussion that I think ties into one of the biggest problems we have in our society today. Well, two of them. One is that people seem to be losing the capacity to deal with personal issues themselves. They want government to enact power in ways that government was not designed to enact power. Mainly because I think they, in their own lives, they no longer seem to be able to, resolve conflicts on their own as this country was designed to allow people to do, right?
Let's say, well, I think we've created some of that by saying, oh, you participated, here's your award. We're not going to keep score. Okay, so now everybody's extra important, and there are winners and losers in situations. And sometimes if you don't own the property, you don't necessarily control what happens with it. And that's one of the key pieces to start with. But as a local elected official, balancing concerns and constituent concerns based on the law and based on liberty and freedom, which is part of what ACE is focused on, which is why I enjoy coming to it, you really sit there and have to go, wait a second. Let me get down to the underlying arguments of the concern you're raising to figure out what the legal aspect is. Most people that are local elected officials are not attorneys. And even the attorneys that are there oftentimes are not municipal experts. So figuring it out, you've got to really have good core principles of liberty, freedom, understand the Constitution, and go, okay, is this really right or wrong? And based on the law.
Interesting. Now, I understand you were discussing some of this recently. You were giving I believe a talk on this, right?
Yeah, we're talking about inclusionary zoning, different types of zoning aspects, and low-income housing, which is always one of those, what does that mean and for who?
Yeah, well, and this is, I'd imagine, in government right now, one of the big issues you're facing. In a lot of parts of the U.S., we have a lot of homelessness. A lot of that is caused by drugs. We have a lot of people who want housing for these individuals. And the question is, I guess, how do we really help them? Will that help them? Will that actually keep them off the streets? And will that resolve the problem fundamentally? And I would imagine that in government, it's very hard to deal with issues like this because you have to try to find a solution to something that may or may not help a person in the long run.
Right.
And I know sometimes when it comes to government, short-term solutions win votes a lot of times because people want immediate results.
Or if it feels good.
Yeah. Or if
it made me feel good to help them with that, and it's like, yeah, but that's not helping them. And that's where, especially when you come down to homelessness issues, or people who are, a lot of what we see is paycheck to paycheck, and you can, there's recent surveys that say that half the population doesn't have an emergency $1,000 they can pull on. So people who are living paycheck to paycheck typically they're going to an eviction process because of either a medical issue, a sickness, or I should say, a medical issue, sickness, or some sort of auto issue occurs. Their car breaks down, something like that, or they've got something. It's a situation where they've lost their job and they're getting a new one, but they're a couple weeks without pay, and literally it's about $300 on average. You can help somebody stay in their housing, and that's a good public purpose. If you look at K through third grade, keeping kids in stable housing and stable schools at that time is very important. Now, if they don't, by third grade, the reason that's important, let me back up. The reason is because by third grade, they're either reading or they're not. And if you don't have stable housing up through that K through third grade, you're not going to break the chains of poverty. And you've got cycles of poverty that you're just continuing. So supporting that as a public mission is a good thing. Now, how do we go about doing it? And that's really where you start getting a divergence of process. Well, we should just throw money at them and give them until they can stay. That doesn't necessarily help them either. But there are ways to do it and say, you know what, you may not need a McMansion to live in, but you need some stable, quality, affordable housing. And let's look at what that means, because a lot of times we're talking about a single mom, 2, 3 kids, and she's now trying to figure out, how do I balance this family, home, and a lot of times working 60, 70 hours a week to do that. How can we help as a society not to put obstacles in the way, first of all? That's one of the biggest things. And then figuring out, how do we balance affordable housing, where it can be, how we can support it in a community from a government perspective without mandating every developer, as I say, just because there's a famine, you don't tax a farmer. That doesn't help us out. We need developers to actually build, and we want them to build more. And if they're making profit, that's good, because they're going to continue developing. If you've got plenty of housing, you're going to keep the prices down. It's basic supply and demand. And instead, we try to put obstacles in the way, and you end up getting a limitation on supply, which causes the housing prices to go up. And then you get this downward spiral that somebody in that situation, as a mom with a couple of kids, has a hard time holding housing, let alone finding it.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I'm sure that having both kind of the government, perspective and also the private business perspective, you can see how sometimes government intervention really has negative effects in terms of what the real end goal is and how that balancing works. I was talking with someone before on this show where, we were discussing how sometimes government might put additional tax or additional costs on businesses, believing it's going to, impact the businesses and make them, provide a better service somehow. When in reality, those prices are passed down from the business to the consumer. And so in the end, it's not the business that pays for it. It's the individual small guy on the street.
That's correct.
And we see that with a lot of interventionist policies, to where, a lot of times it ironically often creates systems of almost oligarchy, where the interventionist policies create costs and regulations that only big businesses can shoulder.
That's correct.
And so how do you try to balance these things? So I'd say deal with the issues brought to your table on the government side, while understanding that you need to protect liberties and not overstep what government should play, as a role in society.
Well, one of the key aspects of that is really getting good stakeholder information, and not stakeholders that I like, all stakeholder information, and finding out what's going to be the unintended consequence. Let's ask that question before we put a policy in place, rather than realizing 2, 3, 5 years down the road, oh no, this is the unintended consequence, and now we're fixing another symptom rather than addressing the initial cause or the real problem. And I think if we can address more, as they say, a real civil approach, understanding that we're going to have different ways of getting there, but if we can at least sit down and have that discussion and dialogue, then we can actually reach solutions. And some of that may be taking a piece of what you've got and a piece of what I've got. As I say, a lot of politics is, sausage. Well, let's face it, there's some sausage that's pretty good when it comes out. Nobody wants to see how it's made, but we need to work through getting to that solution.
Interesting. And the talk you just gave, right? What was kind of the main point you wanted to bring out? What do you really want to communicate with people when it comes to issues like poverty and homelessness and need for housing and affordable housing and balancing that with everything else? So what is the main point you hope people can understand when it comes to these issues?
One of the key pieces is you're not going to tax your way out of a housing issue. You can tax your way out of houses, but you're not going to tax your way out of a housing problem. Letting the market actually go to work and provide. If the market is selling and could sell $120,000 homes, let the market build $120,000 homes, not put, oh, well, we're going to go and slap $50,000 worth of fines and fees and, service charges and this permit fee on top of it when you didn't provide any value. The long-term service of that the taxes that property will generate are what's going to sustain the municipality. You shouldn't be charging up front and really pushing the price of those properties up. What you're doing is removing that first rung of the American dream for a lot of people. And that has been wrong. We've seen it in zoning, whether you go back to the color of law and the racism that was institutionalized in zoning many years ago. It occurred here in Austin as well. Ellen Troxclair, previous council member from Austin, was given an update on that as well. That type of institutional racism has actually impoverished a number of folks that are still not able to climb to that first level of the ladder. I'm not about saying, hey, here's quotas to go in place. Instead, let the market work and people will be able to climb that ladder.
Well, and that's an interesting perspective. That there are markets for different levels of income, and if you allow the market to provide for those different levels of income without placing additional costs on it, then they will do it. Whereas sometimes those additional costs, that just means the price of the product goes up. It doesn't mean that the price of the product stays the same and then people could suddenly afford it. It means the product itself becomes more.
And it becomes out of reach of especially people working paycheck to paycheck, and that is a problem.
Great. Anything else you'd like to say? Any points?
Now, looking forward to working with ACE here on. It's always a learning experience from the networking side to, we've got opioids to budgets to a variety of other issues I'm looking forward to digging into.
Great. And so where can people learn more about some of your work and what you're looking at?
I have a website, charlestassell.org. Tassell.org is one of them. I'm on Facebook, and they can reach out to me anytime.
Great. Real pleasure having you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.